Shabbat Shalom, friends. Grace and peace be upon you, and welcome to another in our study from the book of Matthew. This week we're going to go to Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to talk about the Magi, or they're called Magi's or Magos. We know them as the wise men. And we're going to also talk about the star of Messiah. But before we get into our discussion this week, I'd like for us to take a quick look at what we have studied so far. In chapter 1, from verse 1 through to 17, we read about the genealogy of Yeshua. I shared with you that in Israel, kings were eligible for the throne by three ways. Either through legal right, meaning that the person had to belong to the tribe of Judah, by blood right, meaning that the person had to be a blood descendant from the house of David, or by divine appointment. And by divine appointment, we mean that God would have to choose that individual to be king over Israel, as was the case with King David. Based on the genealogical record that we find in Matthew chapter 1, Yeshua is eligible to be Israel's king by all three ways. 1. As an adopted son of Joseph, he inherited his tribal identity through him. Therefore, Yeshua has legal right to the throne because he is from the tribe of Judah. He is also a bloodline descendant from the house of David through Miriam, or Mary, his mother. And he is divinely appointed as a king priest through the order of Melchizedek, through God, his father, bestowing this order of king priest upon him, just as this title of king priest was also bestowed upon King David. In chapter 1, verse 18 through to 25, Matthew spoke of the sign of Emmanuel, which means God with us. We went all the way back to Isaiah chapters 7 and 8, when this prophecy was first mentioned. I shared with you that King Ahaz of Judah was facing the threat of invasion by the kings of Syria and Israel, but how God sent Isaiah and his son to King Ahaz to assure him and Judah of his protection. Although Israel, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, would experience plunder by Assyria, God reminded them or assured them that he would always be with them. In these chapters, we also read where Isaiah's wife miraculously gave birth to a son with two names, Emmanuel, which means God with us, and Maher Shalal Hashbaz, which means hasten to loot and speed to plunder. All of this happened when the Ruach HaKodesh rested upon her. The birth of the child was a sign to Ahaz and Judah that despite the calamities that would befall Israel and Judah, a remnant would always return and Judah would not be completely destroyed. In the same way, Miriam would supernaturally give birth to a son who would serve as a reminder to Judah that God is with them. This son would also be the one through whom the remnant would return and the house of David would be restored. Welcome back. We're going to now go straight into reading from verse 1 of chapter 2, and we're going to read down to, I think, verse 12. It says, after Yeshua was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi's from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. Then Herod called the wise men secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of frankincense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now, let us go back to verse 1. We're going to work our way down. So Matthew says, after Yeshua was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" Now, let's talk a little bit about Bethlehem or Bethlehem, which means house of bread. It tells us that Yeshua was born in Bethlehem. Now, when we go over to the book of Luke, we find where Luke talks a little bit more about the fact that Yeshua's father was living in the north, but because of a census that was decreed by Caesar, he had to take his family and go to the south in order for the purposes of the census. Matthew skips all of that. Why? Because Matthew just wants to get right to the information that Yeshua was born in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem is also known as the city of David. This is where David was born, and this was a city that was associated with the kings of Judah. Let's read a little bit about it. It says that Bethlehem in Judah was a village about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Matthew says nothing of events in Nazareth that we would read about in Luke 1:26-56, because he wanted to emphasize Yeshua's Davidic background. And so he begins with the events that happened in David's city. It is also called Bethlehem in Judea to make a distinction between another town in the north that was also called Bethlehem. So Matthew wants his readers to understand that we're talking about David's city here, not the Bethlehem in the north, which was close to Nazareth, right? He also wanted to emphasize that Yeshua came from the tribe of Judah, the territory that produced the line of Davidic kings. The Jews expected that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and the Messiah would be from David's family. And we see this in some of the prophetic books, Micah or Micah in particular, chapter 5, verse 2. And we see it quoted here when Herod heard about this king of the Jews that was born. He called all the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he said to them, "Where is the Messiah supposed to come from?" And they said to him, "The prophet wrote, 'But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel.'" And here they're quoting from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. Now that we have covered that, let's take a look at King Herod. So who was King Herod? King Herod the Great ruled from 37 to 4 BCE, before Common Era. He is to be distinguished from the other Herods in the Bible. There were many Herods, including Herod Antipas, who was part of the trial of Yeshua just before his crucifixion. So this is Herod the Great. And he was a non-Jew. He was from a region called Idumea. He was an Edomite. And he was appointed king of Judah by the Roman Senate in 40 BC and gained control in 37. Now, I want you to understand this. The fact that we have a non-Jew ruling over Judea was a big deal. And here's why it was a big deal. If we were to go back to the book of Deuteronomy, remember that in Moshe's last speech to the people, he said to them that a non-Jew was never to rule over them. And a non-Jew ruling over them would be a sign of God's punishment over them. So here we have this Edomite. And remember that Edomites are descendants of Esau. So we have a descendant of Esau ruling over the Jewish people. It says, like many rulers of the day, he was ruthless, murdering one of his wives, 3 of his sons, his mother-in-law, a brother-in-law, and an uncle, and many others whom he suspected of threatening his royal power. This includes the edict that he would give in verse 16 of Matthew chapter 2, where he called for all the children 2 years and younger to be murdered, because all the sons, because this king of the Jews was a direct threat to him. It was a direct threat to Rome also. Because remember, the Messiah's arrival is to dethrone Rome and to return power to Israel as a people, to restore the monarchy to Israel. So we see that Herod was very ruthless and he was not playing with his throne. Anybody who was a threat, he was going to eliminate that threat. Let's read a little bit more about him. It says his reign was also noted for splendor, as seen in many theaters, amphitheaters, monuments, pagan altars, and other buildings he erected or refurbished. And this, by the way, includes the Second Temple. Not a lot of people are aware of this. But if we were to go back to the Tanakh, we will see in books like Haggai and Zechariah and in Nehemiah and Ezra, where the people were so discouraged when they returned and started building their second temple, because the second temple did not carry the same magnificence or the same glory as the first temple had. And so the people were very discouraged. As a matter of fact, the scriptures tell us that Zerubbabel and Joshua, the governor and the priest, were spearheading the rebuilding efforts. But Hashem also had to raise up prophets to go and to encourage the people. Hashem had to say to them, do not despise the day of small beginnings, because Hashem is just happy to see that the work has begun, and to encourage the people's spirits, because they were so discouraged by the fact that the second temple was nothing like the first temple. But what we read in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 24, was that the second temple became so magnificent to the point where the disciples were admiring the temple one day, and they were talking about how beautiful the structure was and all of these things. And Yeshua said to them, even though it's so magnificent, there is going to come a time when not one stone will be left standing on another. Why was the temple was so magnificent? Herod the Great, he refurbished the temple. He expanded it and put more walls around it and made it great. As a matter of fact, the work that he was doing on it outlived him, because as it says here, this work began in 20 BCE, but it wasn't finished until 68 years after his death. So he didn't even get to live to see how fantastic this temple was going to be, but he did begin this work of expansion. And according to the rabbis, he did that because he wanted to get into the good graces of the Jews. He was a non-Jew, but he wanted to get into the good graces of the Jewish people. So he made the effort to rebuild or to refurbish the temple. So this is what we know about Herod so far. Let's now talk about these wise men or these magi. So it tells us that they were men from the east. And it's important for us to understand why Matthew would say that they came from the east. It is because of what the east represented or what was associated with the east. East of Jerusalem meant that we're looking at places like Mesopotamia, Media and Persia and Babylonia. We know that that area was ruled by paganism. So these Magi's were actually magicians. They're also known to be priests of their religion. They were religious men. They were also astrologers. They consulted the stars and so on with whatever it is that they were doing. And later on, we will get an understanding of who exactly these men were and why they would come in search of the Messiah. These are non-Jews. So what significance would a Jewish Messiah have for them? We will find out a little bit more about that later on. So now that we have looked at all of those things, let's talk about the star, because it tells us that these men saw a star in the east, and so they followed the star, and the star took them to Herod, who they asked about the king of the Jews. So why was there a star leading these men to Yeshua? We know that these are men who studied the stars, but what was so different about this star? Was it like a spiritual star, an angel? Was it a cosmic occurrence? What was this star? But most importantly, we want to know, did the Tanakh or any of the Hebrew prophets prophesy about a star? Where did this star come from? Because one thing we're clear about, and it's this: whatever it is that we see in the Brit Hadashah, we can always go back to the Tanakh and we can find types and patterns, and we can find all of these different things in the Tanakh. So the first thing that I want us to do is to go to Bereshit chapter 1. We're going to look at verse 1 through to 3. This is what it says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So it tells us that in the beginning, there was chaos, there was darkness, there was confusion. However, God spoke. And when God spoke, light was introduced into the darkness. How are we to understand this? It's telling us that whenever God acts or reveals himself in this physical realm, there are supernatural occurrences. So in this case, when God spoke, there was a supernatural occurrence where light was introduced. Why? Because God is the source of light. So his mere words would bring light into this realm. And this reminds us of another example that we see at Mount Sinai. Because when Hashem stepped into this realm, it tells us that when he descended upon Mount Sinai, there was lightning, thunder, shofar blasts, and smoke, and all of these different things. And even the people who were standing at the foot of the mountain experienced the supernatural as well, because they were able to see voices and they were able to understand what was being said in their own language, even though there were there was a mixed multitude. Different people speaking different languages all at the base of Mount Sinai, but everybody was able to hear and understand the words that were being spoken to them in their own language. Because, like I said, when Hashem steps into this realm, or when he acts in this realm, there is always a supernatural occurrence. There are cosmic occurrences. All sorts of things are happening. This also reminds us of what we see happening in the book of Acts on the day of Pentecost, as it's called. Because the same thing that happened at Mount Sinai pretty much was experienced by these believers who were in the temple on that day during Shavuot. It tells us that fire came and sat upon the heads of the individuals, and they were able to speak in languages that they were not formally trained in. So there was always a supernatural occurrence. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this for us to understand that if Hashem was going to send his anointed one into the earth realm, then there would have to be cosmic disturbance. There would have to be cosmic occurrences. In this case, these wise men saw a star. Now, with this said, I would like for us to go to verse 14 and also verse 15. Because here we're going to take a look at what happened on the fourth day of creation. So it tells us that on the fourth day of creation, God said, "Let there be lights." So this lights that Hashem is calling forth on the fourth day is different from the light that we saw in verse 2, right, of chapter 1. Verse 2 of chapter 1 is a different light. Verse 14, these lights have to do with the sun, moon, stars. So it says here, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night." But there was supposed to be more. It says these lights would serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. So these sun, moon, and stars were to serve as signs. So, like I said before, something as significant as God acting in this physical realm by sending his anointed one would definitely have to be accompanied by cosmic signs. And so this is why we see these wise men following this star to Jerusalem. Because as astrologers, remember, they're looking also in the cosmos for their own signs. So they saw something supernatural and they knew that something was different. But there is more, and we are going to talk a little bit about that. So let's talk a little bit more now about these wise men, which, by the way, they were not three wise men. The scriptures are silent on how many wise men there were, but a lot of times people tell the Christmas story and say, oh, it's three wise men because they were gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. So if they're gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, people just automatically think that it would be one gift per wise man, right? So but the scriptures don't tell us how many wise men there were. So are these wise men from the east connected to a figure in the Torah? The answer is yes. I would like to take us to the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, we are going to read about a man called Balaam. Balaam was hired to curse Israel because the Moabites and the Midianites were fearful that Israel would come and take their land from them, and they had heard how God had moved supernaturally, and so it says that they were fearful. And so when they realized that they could not beat Israel militarily, they decided to resort to witchcraft. And the scriptures tell us that they got a man called Balaam, who was from Mesopotamia. So it tells us that Balaam was from a place called Pethor. It was a town in Mesopotamia. So they're all coming from the same place, Balaam and these wise men. As a matter of fact, it is said that these wise men were actually students of Balaam. They came under his tutelage. Of course, there would have been an enormous age gap, but remember that there are students of people who have passed a long time ago, but their teachings are still there. Their teachings still exist. So they were associated or connected to Balaam. And this is going to get even clearer to us now, because we're going to take a look at something that Balaam said when he was told to curse Israel. We're going to look at his fourth oracle. If you will remember that story, Balaam spoke a number of different prophetic words over Israel. When he couldn't curse them, every time he opened his mouth, a blessing came out. So now we're going to look at the fourth oracle that he spoke over Israel. It says, we're reading from verse 15 of chapter 24. Then he spoke this message. The prophecy of Balaam, son of Beor, the prophecy of one whose eye sees clearly, the prophecy of one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. So here he is giving a kind of introduction to his prophecy, and he's saying, this prophecy that I'm about to speak is from the Most High God. This is a prophecy from one whose eye sees clearly. Do you notice he doesn't say his eyes see clearly? He says his eye sees clearly, meaning he is seeing through his prophetic vision. I don't want to use that term, but he's seeing through a special eye, not the physical eyes, but the eye of the spirit, right? He says, the one whose eye sees clearly, the one who knows that he hears the words of God, and who has been given knowledge from the Most High. So let us see what he was shown. He said, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. I see him, but he's not now. He's for a time further in the future. He is seeing into the future. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but he's not near. Then he says this, a star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. Balaam spoke these words. So let's talk a little bit about this. Remember that it was Moab and Midian who had come together to hire him. And so he said to Balak, he said, you want me to curse these people? I can't curse these people. God has already blessed these people. You are afraid of these people, and so you want to destroy them. But here's what's going to happen. Out of these people will raise up one who will destroy you and your people. He will crush the skulls of Moab and the skulls of all the people of Seth or Sheth, right? And he will crush Edom and Seir and all of these different nations, but he will only continue. Israel will only continue to grow stronger. And he said, a star, this one is a star, or there is a star that is connected to him. A star will come out of Jacob. So these wise men knew about this prophecy of the star. They had heard about this star. that would come out of the Jews, and they were expecting this star to come. Also, remember, these people are pagans, right? So they're polytheistic. They worship many gods because each god would have something that they could benefit from for use in their divination or whatever. So when they heard about this promised one, this star that would come out of Jacob, who would be a special leader, they wanted to go and worship this king. They wanted to go on and get a foot in with this supernatural one that was coming, right? And they had heard the prophecy. Now, also in this passage, we can see why Herod was terrified, because Balaam's prophecy said that Edom would be crushed. Remember, Herod was an Edomite, or an Idumean. So it would have had consequences for Edom. And remember, Rome was also part of Edom, right? But also for him as an Edomite. And this is one of the reasons to why he got scared. And he too would have known about this messianic figure. As a non-Jew, he would have heard. Last week in our Torah portion, we were talking about how Hashem worked through Israel so that the nations of the world would hear about him and know about him. All the nations knew about this king who would be just like his father David in terms of his warrior-like abilities and also his political clout and influence, and that he would rule the nations and all the nations would be subject to him, and so on and so forth. So these wise men from the east knew about this prophecy, and they were connected to Balaam. They had heard about this star that would come from Jacob. And so they saw this cosmic phenomenon and knew that it was a fulfillment of the oracle of their forefather. This is just so amazing. Now, I want us to go to Matthew chapter 2, verse 12. Just for a second. Matthew chapter 2, verse 12 says that the men were warned to not go back to Herod. They were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. And you know, this reminds me of something that happened when Balaam was summoned by Balak to come and curse Israel. Do you remember that God warned him in a dream not to curse Israel? He was warned in a dream. So just as he was warned in a dream, these men were also warned in a dream that they could not go and go back to Herod. So as we're talking about cosmic activities, let me say this. Just as they were cosmic activities when the Messiah first appeared, so too there will be cosmic occurrences when he returns. I want you to also understand that even in our time, when there are certain things happening in the world, there are lots of cosmic occurrences. Do not separate the cosmic occurrences with what's happening. I remember when this upheaval in the Holy Land first began, we had this eclipse called the Ring of Fire. I don't know if you remember that. And all different kinds of stuff have been happening in the skies. However, the scriptures also tell us that just before Yeshua's arrival, his return, there is also going to be cosmic occurrence. I want us to go to Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to see Yeshua himself. He is quoting actually something that was said in the book of Joel. And it says in verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days, after what is called the tribulation period, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. So it tells us here that just before his return, there will also be another cosmic occurrence. And notice too that unlike his birth when he just entered in, which was, sweet and soft and nice with a beautiful bright star shining and all of these different things, when on his return, it's not going to be anything like that. It says the sun will be darkened. There will be total darkness. And the moon will not give its light, and the stars will not give its light either. And the whole of all the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Planets, everything will be shaken. There would be a total upset of the cosmos on his return. Because when God is doing something in this realm, there is an upset. If you are going to be introducing the spiritual at such an amazing magnitude into the physical can't manage certain things. So this is what I want you to understand, that just as it was at his first coming, so shall it be in his second coming. It's just that, of course, now in his second coming, he's not coming as a babe. He's coming as a warrior king. So things would be ramped up like 1,000 times over, right? But we see that there will still be that kind of occurrence. And also I want to draw your attention to something that we read in verse 26 and also 27. So this is what it says. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So people who believe that there is going to be some secret coming of the Messiah, he's going to come secretly and all of those different things, that's not what he said. He said, when people come and say to you, oh, the Son of Man is over there, or oh, the Messiah is over there, do not believe it, because he says it's going to be so visible. It's going to be so visible. He says, as lightning comes from the east, is visible even in the west, so will it be in the coming of the Son of Man. Now, I want us to go back to Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to look at a couple of verses over there. Verse 9. It says, after they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, who in Hebrew is Miriam. That's her Hebrew name, Miriam. And they bowed down and worshipped him. Now, it says in verse 11 that they came to the house. So it tells us that he was no longer at the place where he was born. He was now at home, right? He was now in a house, in a physical house with his mother. And so this tells us that these little pictures that we see with, the wise men going to the manger and, all of these different things, it's not biblical, because the Bible tells us that on coming to the house, right? On coming to the house, they saw the child. They saw the child with his mother. So it says here, the Magi did not visit Yeshua at the manger on the night of his birth. They came some months later and visited him as a child in his house, because the scriptures say that the child was with his mother. So here we have again a powerful connection between the book of Matthew and the Tanakh, because he wants his Jewish audience to understand the prophecies. And here we have a prophecy not only from the Hebrew prophets, where you could say, oh, they're just prophesying about some fictitious or mythological king who would come and rescue them from oppression. No, because it's so amazing, but Hashem has witnesses, right? And he has people who can validate what he's doing, whether it's in the Jewish world or the non-Jewish world, because these men operated on a prophecy that was spoken by a non-Jew. This is just so powerful. Now, before we go, I'd like to share something very interesting with you. Now, we know that there are Jewish people, majority of the Jewish people do not believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. And we have discussed this on a number of different occasions as to why they don't believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. But I find this very interesting because on Chabad.org, which is a very popular Jewish site, it says something about this prophecy that Balaam made concerning the Star of Jacob. So this is what it says over there. This is a messianic prophecy. The prophet Balaam saw both King David and the Messiah interchangeably, right? Because of course the Messiah would be a son of David. So this messianic power or light would begin with his father David and also would continue through him, albeit that it would be at a greater magnitude than when it was with David. But I found this very interesting. It says Moshiach's coming will introduce new light into our existence, brightening our horizons. Isn't this amazing? Because this would even give us greater insight into what I shared earlier, that when he came as a child or as a human being at that first coming, right, he brought light. He brought light. But when he's returning as that king, it's going to be darkness for many people, right? And so here Chabad is saying that Mashiach's coming will introduce new light into our existence. And isn't that what Yeshua has done for those who believe in him? He has introduced new light into our existence and brightened our horizons. It says here the Hasidic tradition, Hasidic or Hasidim, by the way, means pious, very righteous Jews. It's another branch of Judaism, right? So it says Hasidic tradition explains that every person is a star because every person contains a spark of Mashiach within his soul. Isn't this powerful? Because we who believe in the Messiah believe that we carry a spark of the Mashiach in our soul, and he has brought new light into our existence. Very amazing. Sometimes when you study some of these writings by some of these rabbis and sages, you say, how can they not know Mashiach? But then you go back to Isaiah chapter 6 and you recognize why they don't know Mashiach. Some of them know, but majority of them don't recognize because it has been hidden from them. You know, Isaiah said that they would always be seeing but never perceiving, and always hearing but never understand what they're hearing. So we say Baruch Hashem for the Ruach HaKodesh, who has brought us into truth and brought us into an understanding of the Mashiach, of who he is and the light that he has brought into our existence. Thank you so much for having joined us, and I pray that you will have an amazing week ahead. Until we meet again, Shalom, Shalom, and Kol Tov.